The man who is, and a very good one, John Yoo, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. John, what came of this today? I mean, you're obviously seeing Republicans try to paint him as a guy who has a double standard, go full throttle rough on Donald Trump, take a pass on your present boss, Joe Biden. Did they succeed?
First, I'm glad you and David are not lawyers, because that's the only reason most Americans can understand what you're saying these days. Hardly. Here's what I think: if you were Merrick Garland's aides, you would tell him when he walked out the door of that hearing, mission accomplished. You were on the stand essentially for 6 hours and made no news. He let nothing slip. He answered no questions, right? You can't even put your finger on anything he said. The answer to every question was, I left it all in the special counsel's hands. I left it all in David Weiss's hands. And so in a way, Garland achieved what he wanted to do. You could see the members of the House on the Republican side were getting very frustrated with him, as you saw in those clips. But the other lesson that comes out of it is that there's still a lot of questions that are hanging over this investigation, both into Trump and into Biden. Are the two cases being treated differently? How does the Attorney General explain the testimony from all these whistleblowers who say that their efforts to get to the bottom of the Hunter Biden scandal were slow-walked or frustrated by higher Justice Department officials? So to get those answers, what we learned from today's hearing is that the House is not going to get any help from the Justice Department. It's got to conduct the investigation on its own and get to the bottom of it by themselves.
All right, so they won't have any help from the Justice Department in that, but should that be the way it goes?
Here's the interesting thing, because the Justice Department still needs to be helpful, because as we've talked about before, the House has now converted this from oversight of the Justice Department to find out if there was any obstruction, interference with the investigation into Hunter, to see whether there's any political motivation into the investigation into former President Trump. And that's turned into an impeachment investigation. That raises a whole lot of other questions. It raises the constitutional stakes. And on this one, the Justice Department would be necessary to help Congress, for example, go after people who refuse to testify. What happens when the House, this committee, calls Hunter Biden to testify, as they eventually will, and Hunter gives him the back of the hand and refuses to show up? It's the Justice Department that will have to drag him into court. Are they going to help the House now with their impeachment investigation? Are they going to side with President Biden and refuse to cooperate?
Maybe it bends credulity here, and maybe this is just the way it is. When Garland was repeatedly, saying that he is not the president's lawyer, that he didn't share or even discuss, if I heard it correctly, John, the whole Hunter Biden situation with him. Is that viable to you? I mean, technically, that's the way it's supposed to work, but I'm sure Weiss and his staff had alerted, certainly, Garland of the indictments, the gun indictments that were pending and going to be the three of them against Hunter Biden. And it would be tempting to think that Garland would just give the president a heads up. I hate to break this to you, sir, but your son is going to be facing these three indictments that could land him in jail for up to 25 years. None of that happened?
Once again, you remind us, I wish some of the members of the House had gone to the Cavuto School of Law, because they should have asked exactly those questions. They could have said, for example, well, Mr. Garland, you say you're not President Biden's lawyer, but under the Constitution, you work for President Biden. It's actually President Biden who's in charge of enforcing the law. You're saying not just Garland, but nobody in the Justice Department ever talked to anybody in the White House about these cases? Maybe Garland didn't, but there's a Deputy Attorney General. There are all these aides to both of them. If they didn't talk about it with them, who's really in charge of making these decisions to keep David Weiss? One thing that came out of the hearings that was interesting is that when Garland showed up for the job, it had already been decided to keep Weiss on to investigate the Hunter Biden case. Nobody seems to be responsible for that decision. That raises this question: who's really calling the shots within the executive branch about these cases? For Garland to say it's not me actually makes you wonder, well, who's doing your job then? Because that's Garland's job, reporting to President Biden ultimately.
But what if Garland is also saying, as the Attorney General of the United States and the lawyer for the people, or however you want to interpret it, I don't want to present to my boss that possible conflict, so I'm going to have one of my underlings do it. What about that?
that's exactly what I think very well might have happened, is that Garland might say, I never talked to the president. But as we've seen from some of the earlier testimony with the whistleblowers, they keep pointing the finger at people in the Deputy Attorney General's office, maybe even the Deputy Attorney General herself. Maybe they're the ones who are talking to the White House about this. But if they weren't, that's also troublesome. That's also problematic, because the president ultimately is the one under the Constitution who's in charge of all of this.
Amazing. Well, John, I love your legal compliments to me, but you're the real deal, my friend, and a brilliant real deal at that. This doesn't end, my friend, to your point. John Yoo, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, UC Berkeley Law, former Justice Thomas Law Clerk. You see, that's gravitas right there, not just the Neil Cavuto of LA law fame.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.